The night should have been quiet, but instead our front yard turned into a battlefield. My girlfriend stood shaking with anger, my brother's voice echoed down the street, and a police cruiser pulled up just as the HOA president smirked from across the fence. For months, we had put up with their petty fines, their threats, their constant interference in our lives. But that night, everything snapped. The lines were crossed, the masks came off, and the truth about the HOA's corruption started spilling into the open. What happens when an ordinary family finally fights back against an all-powerful HOA? Life in the neighborhood was supposed to be simple. The street curved in a quiet loop, framed by tall oak trees and trimmed lawns that looked almost too perfect. At first glance, it seemed like the kind of community people dream of: safe, neat, and close-knit. Families waved at each other on evening walks, kids rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac, and barbecues on weekends filled the air with the smell of smoke and laughter. For us, moving here was meant to be a fresh start. I had just landed a better job, my girlfriend was thrilled about having her own little garden, and my younger brother, who had been staying with us, was looking forward to a sense of stability. The house wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it was ours, a place where we thought we could breathe, grow, and finally have some peace. But even in neighborhoods that look perfect on the surface, there's always a shadow. In ours, it came in the form of the HOA, the homeowners association that promised to protect property values but seemed more interested in flexing power than building community. At first, their presence felt distant, almost harmless. A newsletter slipped into the mailbox, a reminder about trash bins not being left out too long, a warning about lawn height. Small things, petty things. Things we brushed off as minor inconveniences. But behind those polite notices was a group of board members who thrived on control. They walked the neighborhood with clipboards in hand, peering over fences, taking photos of driveways, measuring the smallest details as if they were inspectors in a military zone. Everyone whispered about them, but few dared to challenge them. Neighbors who pushed back found themselves drowning in fines or locked in endless disputes. At first, we kept our heads down. My girlfriend spent hours tending to her flowers, proud of the bursts of color lining our walkway. My brother would tinker in the garage, working on his car with music playing softly in the background. And I would sit on the porch in the evenings, grateful for the calm after years of scraping by in noisier, rougher neighborhoods. We thought we could handle the HOA's quirks. We thought that if we followed the rules, they would leave us alone. We were wrong. It started with small notes that didn't make sense, claims that our paint shade was too bright, even though it had been approved. Then came warnings about the garden beds being non-compliant, despite half the street having the same setup. At first we laughed it off, assuming it was some mistake. But the letters kept coming, each one sharper, each one more demanding. Neighbors began to look at us differently. Some offered sympathetic glances, others avoided eye contact altogether, as though getting too close to us might draw the HOA's attention to their own homes. A few quietly admitted they'd been through the same thing, but none of them had pushed back. The message was clear: keep quiet, pay up, or prepare for war. That uneasy tension lingered in the air like a storm cloud that refused to move. And while we tried to live our normal lives, planting, fixing, laughing, trying to ignore it, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were circling us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment was coming faster than we realized. The first official letter arrived in a crisp white envelope with the HOA's emblem printed neatly at the top. At first glance, it almost looked like something important, like a tax notice or a government form. But when I opened it, the message was anything but professional. It claimed our front yard was out of compliance because of unauthorized landscaping. The wording made it sound like we had installed a fountain or built a massive stone wall without permission. In reality, my girlfriend had planted a row of tulips and daisies by the walkway, bright, cheerful, completely harmless flowers, the kind of thing that should have added charm to the neighborhood. We were told we had 7 days to correct the violation or face a $150 fine. It seemed ridiculous, almost laughable, but laughter turned into unease when I realized this wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand, and ignoring it would only invite more trouble. We decided to contest it. My girlfriend sent photos showing the flowers, pointing out that several neighbors had similar gardens. A week later, another envelope arrived. Instead of an apology, it was another notice. This one accused us of failing to maintain aesthetic harmony and doubled the fine. That's when the cracks in our calm life began to spread. The fines didn't stop. One week it was the color of our shutters, apparently too bold. The next, it was my brother's car. He had parked it in the driveway while working on it, tools scattered beside him. The HOA claimed it was unsightly and slapped us with a $200 violation. Never mind that the car was fully registered, insured, and operational. To them, a man fixing his own vehicle was a crime against the neighborhood's image. We tried reasoning with them. My brother wrote a polite letter explaining that he was nearly done with the repairs. The response? Another fine with an added threat of further enforcement measures. It was clear this wasn't about rules, it was about control. Neighbors started noticing. Some whispered their support when the board members weren't around. One older man admitted he had been fined for leaving his trash bins out for too long, even though he worked night shifts and physically couldn't bring them in until morning. Another woman told us she had received a violation for having wind chimes on her porch, excessive noise disturbance, according to the HOA. Everyone had a story, everyone was afraid. But while they stayed quiet, we were quickly becoming the HOA's favorite target. Things escalated further one Saturday morning. My girlfriend had been trimming the flowers when two board members walked straight onto our property without knocking. Clipboards in hand, cameras around their necks, they began snapping photos of our yard like paparazzi. When I confronted them, they calmly informed me that the HOA had the right to inspect properties at any time. Their tone was smug, practiced, as though they had delivered this line countless times before. That invasion of privacy lit a fire in us. My girlfriend's hands were trembling, not with fear but with fury. My brother stormed out of the garage demanding they leave, but the board members only smirked, jotting notes as though our anger was proof of guilt. The following week, another letter arrived, this one accusing us of harassment against the HOA representatives. The irony was sickening. We were the ones being stalked and photographed, yet somehow we were the aggressors. And of course, there was another fine attached. At this point, the stress was eating into every part of our lives. Meals were interrupted by the thought of another notice showing up. Nights were restless, filled with whispered arguments about whether to fight back or just give in. My girlfriend stopped tending her garden altogether, too afraid of drawing more attention. My brother barely spoke, his jaw tight whenever the subject came up. The house that once felt like a haven was now a cage under surveillance. And still the HOA kept pushing. They sent a warning about our mailbox, claiming it was not in uniform with the community standard, even though it had been installed by the builder before we even moved in. They accused us of having non-compliant outdoor furniture because of a single lawn chair my brother had left on the porch. Each letter grew sharper, more aggressive, dripping with the arrogance of people who thought they were untouchable. But what broke us wasn't the letters, it was what happened at the community meeting. We decided to attend, hoping to finally speak face-to-face with the board. Maybe, just maybe, they would listen if we stood our ground in public. The meeting hall was a modest room inside the clubhouse, filled with folding chairs and stale coffee. The board sat at the front like royalty on a stage. When it was our turn to speak, I calmly laid out our case, how the notices were unfair, how the fines made no sense, how the rules seemed selectively enforced. My girlfriend's voice cracked with emotion as she described how much joy her garden had once brought her, now replaced with constant anxiety. For a brief moment the room seemed sympathetic, neighbors nodded, a few even murmured in agreement. But the board shut us down with rehearsed efficiency. They claimed the rules were clear, that their inspections were legal, that we were disruptive homeowners unwilling to cooperate. They painted us as the problem, not them. And just like that, the meeting moved on, leaving our words hanging in the air like smoke no one wanted to breathe. When we left, I saw the look in my brother's eyes. He wasn't defeated, he was enraged. The harassment doubled after that. 2 fines in a single week, one for improperly stored garden tools, another for excessive noise when my brother played music in the garage during the afternoon. Then came a certified letter threatening legal action if we didn't pay the mounting balance. The balance had climbed into the thousands. It was a trap and we knew it. The fines weren't about compliance, they were a weapon designed to force us into submission or push us out entirely. But we refused to bow. My brother started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, copies of letters, even recordings of board members loitering near our property. My girlfriend reached out to other neighbors, quietly gathering their stories. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore, we were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear of retaliation. And just when we thought things couldn't get worse, the HOA made their boldest move yet. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange notice posted on our door. It was a final warning stating that if we didn't pay our outstanding fines immediately, the HOA would place a lien on our home. A lien meant they could eventually force us into foreclosure. In other words, we could lose everything. My girlfriend broke down in tears on the porch. My brother punched the air in frustration, muttering about how he wouldn't let them get away with it. I just stood there, staring at that piece of paper, feeling the weight of the trap closing in. It was the ultimate abuse of power, turning the very roof over our heads into leverage. But what the HOA didn't expect was that we weren't going to fold. We were ready to push back harder than ever. And when the confrontation finally exploded, when my girlfriend's voice shook the street, when my brother's rage boiled over, and when the police cruiser rolled up to our driveway, the HOA discovered they had underestimated us all along. The cop stepped out of his car, scanning the scene. The board members stood with smug confidence, certain the law was on their side. But as he listened, as he looked at the evidence, his face shifted. And in that moment, we realized this fight was about to turn in a direction the HOA never expected. The day of the breaking point began deceptively normal. The sun rose over the neat little cul-de-sac, casting warm light over manicured lawns and freshly washed driveways. Neighbors moved about quietly, coffee cups in hand, ready to start their routines. But on our porch, an uneasy storm was brewing. Pinned to the door was yet another notice from the HOA. This one wasn't just a fine or a warning. It was an intent to lien letter, typed in bold at the top. A formal threat that if we didn't pay thousands of dollars in alleged violations, the board would move to seize our home. It was the sharpest knife they could twist, the most aggressive power play they had, and it was the moment that snapped the last thread of restraint holding us back. My girlfriend, usually soft-spoken, marched straight to the front yard and began tearing the notice into shreds. Her hands shook, her chest heaved, and her voice finally broke free in a scream that echoed across the neighborhood. She had spent months bottling the rage, the humiliation, the helplessness, and now it came spilling out all at once. My brother stormed out of the garage, fists clenched, his face burning red. He dragged a folding chair into the yard and planted it firmly by the street like a soldier daring the enemy to strike. His message was clear: we weren't going to be intimidated anymore. And that's when the board members arrived. 3 of them, clipboards tucked under their arms, smug expressions plastered across their faces. They didn't knock. They didn't hesitate. They simply walked right up to our property line as though they owned not just the neighborhood but us. One of them read aloud from a prepared statement accusing us of noncompliance, harassment, and creating a hostile environment. Their words dripped with arrogance, designed to provoke, to push us into losing control. It worked. My girlfriend shouted back, demanding they leave. My brother's chair screeched as he jumped up, his voice booming across the street. The tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Neighbors peeked from windows, curtains twitched, doors cracked open. The entire cul-de-sac was watching. And then came the sound that shifted everything, the low hum of a police cruiser pulling into the street. The car rolled to a stop at the curb, lights flashing silently. For a split second, the board members smirked in victory, confident that the law would sweep in on their side as it always had. The officer stepped out slowly, adjusting his vest, scanning the scene with calm, measured eyes. His presence pulled the crowd tighter. More neighbors slipped out of their houses now, drawn by the spectacle. The HOA president wasted no time. He strode toward the officer, papers in hand, voice raised in mock indignation. He painted us as the villains, unruly homeowners who refused to follow community standards, aggressive troublemakers disturbing the peace. He gestured dramatically to my girlfriend, still trembling with fury, and to my brother, standing rigid like a coiled spring. The officer listened, nodding politely, but then he turned his attention to us. My brother stepped forward first, holding out the thick binder of evidence he had been compiling for months. Photos, letters, timestamps, proof of harassment, proof of selective enforcement, proof of the HOA's relentless campaign against us. His voice shook with intensity as he explained how they had trespassed, how they had fined us for imaginary violations, how they had threatened our very home. My girlfriend spoke next, her voice raw but steady, describing the fear that had crept into every corner of our lives. She painted a picture of nights filled with anxiety, of joy stripped from her garden, of a home turned into a battleground. And then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I simply told the officer what we had endured, how far the board had gone, and what was at stake. I handed him the intent to lien notice, the paper that had pushed us to the brink. The officer studied it quietly, his brow furrowed. He flipped through the binder, page after page of evidence too detailed, too damning to ignore. When he finally looked up, the air shifted. His tone was different now, firmer, sharper. He turned back to the board members and asked if they had authorization for their actions, if they had followed proper legal procedures, if they had the right to threaten foreclosure over disputed fines. For the first time, their confidence cracked. Their answers stuttered, their smug expressions faltered. The officer pressed harder, pointing out inconsistencies, questioning their authority, reminding them that harassment, trespassing, and false claims were not protected under HOA bylaws. The crowd of neighbors leaned in closer, their murmurs rising. Some gasped, others whispered. The balance of power was shifting right in front of their eyes. And then the moment came, the moment that flipped the entire battle on its head. The officer closed the binder, looked directly at the board president, and delivered the words we had been waiting months to hear. From what I see here, you're the ones out of line. The street erupted, gasps, murmurs, even a few cheers slipped through the crowd. The board members froze, caught in the blinding light of public humiliation. Their authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling in real time. The officer didn't stop there. He warned them that continued harassment could result in civil or even criminal consequences. He reminded them that homeowners had rights too, and that abusing power under the guise of protecting property values was not only unethical but potentially illegal. And then, with deliberate clarity, he turned back to us and said, "Keep documenting everything, you're doing the right thing." It was vindication, it was validation, it was the moment the chains of fear snapped apart. The HOA members stumbled away, their clipboards hanging limp at their sides. Their faces burned with embarrassment as neighbors whispered and stared. For once, they weren't the enforcers. They were the exposed, the judged, the defeated. My girlfriend's tears weren't of fear this time, they were of release. My brother exhaled, the weight of months of rage finally lifting. And I stood there, heart pounding, knowing we had reached the turning point. The HOA had pushed too far, they had underestimated us, and now the entire neighborhood had witnessed their downfall. But this was only the beginning of the end, because while the confrontation had given us victory in the moment, the real reckoning was still to come. The liens, the fines, the intimidation, none of it would vanish overnight. We had won the battle, but the war for our home, for our dignity, was far from over. And as the officer drove away, leaving the HOA stripped of their false authority, we made a silent vow. We weren't just going to fight back. We were going to expose them completely.